Hey there, I'm Scott. This is Tangents. Thinking I'm probably not going to lose that little bit of intro. At least it just doesn't seem to want to happen. So why swim against the stream there? Um, Today I want to talk a little bit about some mathish, physicsy shit, but I'm gonna try to do it at. I'm gonna see how this works, but I'm gonna try to straddle levels so that there's enough there that Gil might find it, or someone like Gil might find it interesting, but also so that people like Brian don't have their eyes glaze over when I get into it. I've been working, well, you might notice this is a little later than I normally try to do. My schedule has been pretty badly backed up, and it's really annoying. It's like an active, I guess it's like taking out the garbage. You have to kind of, or I'm finding, you have to kind of actively work to condense your schedule so that, I mean, one thing that I learned a while back, and for some reason I can't manage to make this work, but I want meetings just on a few days of the week, and then to have unstructured work time, like big blocks of it, the rest of the time. And the reason for this is, and I'm very good at context shifts and things like this, generally speaking, relative to a lot of people. I can do it fast, I can do it efficiently, but it's still annoying for me. And I also find that it's very, I mean, it sucks, don't get me wrong, to have like a day that's just back to back gangbang of meetings, or a couple of days, or a few days. But when you have, like, I find it preferable to have that than to have like meetings kind of strewn about throughout the entire week. Because there are things that I do that just require like a lot of kind of, how would you say? Just a lot of thinking and tinkering for a while. And when you have meetings like popping up in the middle of it, it's just annoying more than anything. It's not even that it's necessarily, I don't know how much it impacts my productivity, but I know that it irritates the fucking shit out of me. Um, Today, I'm gonna have to like make a database of what my one-word topics have been, and you know, basically like take a dictionary or something and pull those words out of it. Uh, I think that I've already done one on abuse, but that was the thing that I wanted to talk about today. Um, that kind of dovetailing into this mathy shit. The abuse part, and I'm not even gonna, I'm gonna be very, very high level there. But on Twitter, I've talked about this many, many times, but for, I keep saying many, for a very long time, they have had a abuse problem. And it annoys the hell out of me, and it just does not seem to get any better. And I do think I understand the root cause of this is basically it's very easy to set up a Twitter account. So you have a bunch of accounts with like 0 followers, or this account is like 10 followers. And if you go through those 10 follower accounts, they're all equally bullshit looking accounts, and they're all following each other in a little network, which means that without that much difficulty, using pretty basic network algorithms, you could identify these things if Twitter cared to. Not to mention that the bulk of them don't even bother with profile picture, or they have, you know, just the blue background, some bullshit like this. I can tell that Twitter is not doing anything to try to stop this, because if they were, it would be the things that are out there are so trivial to pick out algorithmically that if Twitter was making any effort for it at all, there'd be selective pressure, and you would end up with a bunch of accounts that at least look more plausible, you know? Right now, you can see there's just, it's like nobody's even trying to weed. So you're not starting to get into like the detailed things where, oh, this one's kind of complicated. It's just, if they cared to bother, they could just wipe a shit ton of these out. And of course, as should be obvious, and I think this is, you know, I talked about advertising a few of these back, and it's a kind of a recurring theme because it's one of these things I think that just permeates our society, and it's very hard to get away from. It's kind of intertwined with the need for people to make money, which is fine. I have no, I'm not entirely like anti-capitalist for this reason. I have multiple companies, and you know, I like making money. It's not a, I don't feel even bad about it. The problem is that it's not okay in our society to make some money, or to make a little bit of money, or to make, a comfortable amount to pay people well, and run a good successful company and all of this. It is more the objective that you should make all the money. This is like, like the Amazon problem. Amazon is this huge megalith, and this one company is slurping up all this business that used to be covered by local stores and mom and pop shops. And, it used to be it wasn't like, oh, it was helping 10 people. It used to be many, many thousands of people, maybe even millions of people, had livelihoods that were coming from this giant pool of need. Like, people wanted stuff. I guess want versus need, it straddles a little bit here, but people wanted stuff or needed stuff, and they would buy it someplace locally. Amazon's like, well, we could just get all that shit. And so formerly, the people who used to own those companies would make enough money to have a nice life, put their kids through college, which should be free, but still, have a nice retirement, all of this. They could pay people decently. And, it was like, it was an industry that existed. And now, instead of that, we have Amazon just slurping up all of those things and agglomerating it into one giant megalith. Similarly, I mean, I'm a huge anti-fan of Peter Thiel's. And one of the reasons is that his whole premise is basically creating small monopolies. It's his objective. It's his investment plan. And the problem is, this is like Kyrsten Sinema. I hate to fucking say this, but given the game that is in effect, the rules that we're all stuck playing by, I don't know that you could claim that Peter Thiel is wrong if your objective is to maximize profit and maximize money. Becoming a monopoly is the rational choice to get there. Given, Kyrsten Sinema, and I pick on her a lot. She's not by any means exclusively awful, but she is my senator, so I get particularly annoyed by her. My interpretation, and obviously I'm looking at reality through my pinhole of perception and then trying to come up with my kind of like high dimensional expansion of what's happening there for real. So I could easily be wrong. But my interpretation, looking at her voting record, looking at the stuff that she does, is that basically she is very close to a purely cynical actor. By which I mean, nothing that she does is motivated by anything other than trying to optimize her own standing within the party, her own ability to raise money, her own future success in politics. And I'm not saying that she's got necessarily exclusively the best, the most optimal solution to that, but certainly, given the landscape that we're operating in, she has found a working solution that is hard to argue with. And I think part of this also, she started out trying to go into kind of lefty areas. That didn't work. And you could actually see the exploration, and then she found this niche. And that niche, either way. That one worked for her very well, and then she kind of started doubling down and tripling down on it. And the lefty stuff, now maybe I'm just, and again, this is that pinprick of perception, but in the area of Twitter that I follow, I see so many people shitting all over AOC. And they're doing it like they're actively trying to hate her. And I'm not saying that AOC is perfect, first of all. I have plenty of criticisms for her. But this is a person who got herself elected, which is a shit. I've tried. I'm aware of what's involved in that. I respect anyone who can do it, including Kirsten, incidentally. I don't like the way that she did it. I don't think that she's doing it the right way. But I do respect the fact that, yeah, got herself elected, played the game as it stands and managed, and not only got herself elected, raises shit tons of money. And incidentally has a unknown net worth, which seems like something that shouldn't be possible for someone in Congress, but never mind that now. I do know that at one point when her net worth was known, it was negative because of student loans. I strongly suspect that it's either directly very positive now or indirectly, like she may not actually have those assets, but she has control over assets, which basically makes her wealthy, at least in a small sense. Maybe rich is the better term than wealthy. I don't think there are many actually wealthy people in Congress. They're more rich, by which I mean kind of using Chris Rock's terminology there, which is like Oprah's rich, and Oprah has $1 billion, or more than $1 billion. But Bill Gates is wealthy, and like the difference in magnitude there is hard to fathom because $1 billion is so much money. Anyway, rolling back, Kirsten, I can see why she picks this strategy, because you look at AOC, who's picking this other strategy, and she's very successful, obviously, but you also have this group of people who are like trying to eat their own, trying to attack and undermine somebody. And so like the reason that I even bring that up is yesterday, or maybe the last couple of days, there's been a thing going around Twitter, which basically was saying that AOC said something, which if she actually said it, I would find reprehensible. But then you kind of go and it's, all of the sources are coming from one article. That article itself, it's even in the reference to that article, the interpretation is slightly skewed. But that article itself is referencing an interview in another article, and there's a lot of cherry picking and kind of distortion. So you kind of look at it and you're like, this is, I don't even want to say what the whole thing is, because as far as I can tell, it's total bullshit. It was basically just in support of Biden and labeling criticism of Biden as being anti-black or the equivalent. And you're like, sounds like bullshit. This is the Obama said, if you have a small business, you didn't build that, bells should be going off, and you're like, my bullshit detector is pegged, smells fishy, So you go in and you do the research and you're like, oh, you didn't build the infrastructure and all of the stuff that made your small business possible, which makes sense. He wouldn't actually say you didn't build your small business. Similarly, you go into the context of what AOC said, not as represented. But people are so quick to jump on this skewed version of it that they're just attacking and undermining her. And then also the one that drives me nuts with her is, she's like, hey, get out there, and this is the time that we need to push. And people are like, well, what the fuck? Why should we have to push? You're already in Congress. And it's like, yeah, she's 1 out of 435 votes in the House. You probably have a representative or a senator who is not like her. Statistically, that's almost guaranteed. Push them, and then she can actually do something. Or if you don't like them, replace them, either through yourself by running, or find somebody who can do it and get them fucking elected. I don't know, I'm just getting increasingly tired of seeing people just criticizing and picking her apart for no reason. It annoys the hell out of me. And again, I have my own criticisms of her, but kind of, So going back, and also I don't want to go in depth on Kirsten, but I do see, like, given the landscape, why she'd do what she does. I do see, given the landscape, why people advertise. And I'm not saying you shouldn't ever advertise if you have a company or a product that's good, but a lot of, like, there's letting people know about your product or your company or whatever. And then there's also just annoying the fuck out of people and spamming them. And most of this falls into the latter category. And I'm also very convinced, despite, some people's disagreement, I'm very convinced that a lot of advertising is not actually empirically validated. Like I don't think there's strong evidence. And this is me speculating. This is not based on research. So to be fair, I could be wrong. But I have a strong notion that the connection, the causal connection between advertising and increasing sales or whatever is not really as clear as is presented. I think a lot of it is just kind of folk, kind of like we think this works, so we do it. And I'm not saying also like, you know, I understand if you're Coca-Cola and people who know who you are, there is a effect of, you know, like keep pumping Coke and keep yourself in the zeitgeist, keep yourself, you know. So that kind of advertising, I mean, this is the thing. It's obviously it does work. And obviously if you have a company or a product that nobody's ever heard of, putting it out there in some way, which probably involves advertising, if you're a candidate, advertising yourself, getting your name out there, it's not only important, it's kind of essential. The problem really comes when you're going through Twitter or Facebook or YouTube or whoever, and you're paying them, they're kind of like shoving your shit down somebody's throat. I don't want to go into detail about this. I have my own personal experiences with Facebook as a candidate, and I'm extremely skeptical that their targeting does what they claim it does, mainly because I don't want to go into depth about this, but as a candidate, I paid for Facebook ads, and I did a lot of experimentation with like trying to do market segmentation and targeting people based on geographic location, based on certain, you know, socioeconomic status or keywords or whatever. And I found very consistently, no matter what I did, I wouldn't get a ton of interactions, but I would get them from the same handful of people over and over again. Pretty much independent of what I said, independent of the message, independent of the targeting, I would always come up with the same people responding to my shit. And mostly, you know, I mean, now granted, this is a self-selected subpopulation. It's not like I'm getting some kind of cross-section of the people who are, it's not a random sampling of the people who are actually seeing the thing. I'm not getting a random section of impressions. I'm getting a random section or self-selected section of impressions who are also motivated to respond. But the fact that I would keep seeing the same people come up over and over again, no matter what I did, and especially like you'd look at the population of an area and you'd be like, okay, in my congressional district, there are this many people. I would like to, ideally, I don't want the same people to see my shit 50 times. I want everybody to see this shit a couple of times, you know, which should be possible. And then also, you know, like you get the people that do see it, they either respond badly or they respond well or they don't give a fuck. And the ones that respond badly or well, I don't mind carrying on that conversation if they don't give a fuck. You know, try it a couple more times and then sort of fizzle out. Also fine. But instead of that, I would try to do it. I could not get to other people as far as I could tell. You don't get the statistics at a fine enough granular level to know, which I'm sure is intentional, because if you did see that, then you probably would not be super thrilled with Facebook. There was this thing, I remember Uber, I'm not a fan of Uber, but Uber was paying, I don't remember how many tens of millions of dollars for some advertising network. And due to some weird random bullshit, that stopped briefly. And they saw zero change, like no impact at all in their sales or any of their other numbers. Which means that through this unintentional experiment, they kind of proved both to themselves and to others that, you know, maybe this is not actually doing anything. Now, in this case, it was kind of a fraudulent advertising network. I'm convinced that Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and the such are themselves, you know, Google as well, somewhat fraudulent. Now, I'm not saying they're like 100% fraudulent, but I do think that they sell people who are advertising a bill of goods, which is not really an accurate representation of what they're offering or what they're providing. That being said, rolling back, I understand why companies resort to advertising, because you have to pay the bills. If you're a company, especially if you're a tech company, somehow you have to pay developers, you have to pay people to run this stuff, you have to pay a ton of people. You have to pay for bandwidth and for compute resources, all of this. And if you have a free site, free, giant air quotes, like Facebook or Twitter or what have you, really very quickly start to throw your hands up and you're like, well, what am I going to do? How am I going to pay for this? If you don't have government funding, then you're kind of stuck going down the advertising path. Advertising path pushes you to do stuff that is, I would say, very antisocial and negative. It also, I would say, it kind of turns the site into shit. Because I say this all the time, like Twitter, I would fucking gladly, they don't directly publish their ad revenue per user, their ARPU, but I've looked into it and you can they're a publicly traded company, so you can kind of back into it. You look at how much they're getting for advertising, you see how many users they have. Their ARPU seems to be like ridiculously low. You can find articles on this as well where people have done the same, and it's like, I mean, it's not like $5 a month, it's like $5, $10 per user per quarter. And you look at that and you're like, I'd fucking happily pay $5 to $10 a month to have Twitter without ads. I just would. And if you said Twitter without ads and without the fucking sock puppets, which are massively annoying, I'd be thrilled. So instead of that though, they're fucked on this advertising thing. And again, I don't want to go down the path of like fully exploring that, but it leads to certain bad outcomes, really. It encourages the company who's doing it to do terrible things, I believe. Similarly, you look at the landscape. I'm not saying, again, that cinemas is the only effective strategy or the right strategy by any means. But I do see why someone could rationally, standing on the political landscape, become Pelosi or become cinema. And it's kind of hard to justify to these people that, like, this is what you're doing is bad, because they're like, well, it's working. It's fucking working. I voted for cinema. I despise this person. I still voted for her because McSally was worse. I do have to say, in 2024, if I'm still living in Arizona, not a chance in hell that I'm voting for her, even if McSally or worse is up against her. I will literally just draw in a penis or something rather than vote for her. Hopefully by then I have other options, but fuck that. I can't do it again. I won't do it again. It's just like the Biden thing. Like this actually gets into another thing. I'm sorry, I'm going back into politics. It's just like, it's hard to escape. I voted for Biden. I don't regret voting for Biden. Trump, truly awful. I'm in the same group of Twitter people that I'm talking about here. A lot of people have the impression that, like Trump is just as bad or Biden's just as bad. There's a definite, Trump is much worse than Biden. I don't think that should be a controversial statement. But Biden sucks fucking hairy goat taint. It's like the bar is just so low that, Biden is below ground and Trump is in fucking hell. I mean, it's like, neither one is good. Now, you could say positive things about stuff that they've done, or that Biden has done. You could find positive things about Trump if you really wanted to. And you can look at negative things, but you look on balance. Biden, you look at the appointees and this kind of stuff. There are near attendants in there who are just awful and indefensible, but there are a lot of people who are much better than the Trump appointees. You don't have someone from ExxonMobil running the fucking EPA. It's not great. It's not great, but it's better. I'd say it's objectively better. You don't have the trans ban. You don't have the, what is it called? The global gag order. This is a thing that every president, you get a Republican, global gag order comes back, get a Democrat, global gag order gets shut off, and it just seems to be this perpetual thing. But this abortion thing, yeah, it's a positive thing. I don't mind that. I don't feel bad in that sense about voting for Biden, but I do feel horrible about the fact that my choices were either vote for this fucking shit ass, who could be Biden or could be Sinema, or even Mark Kelly, who incidentally, Mark Kelly, much better than Sinema, but and worlds better than McSally. But still, I've talked to people on his staff about healthcare, and he just has it's the most annoying thing, because his perception, and by his I mean the staff's, but I'm sure his reflects this, their perception of healthcare is so distorted and so skewed. It's like they've not done any research on it at all, or they have the most superficial understanding of it. And it annoys the hell out of me, because there are certain things that should be very clear if you've researched it at all, but they're not to them. And I tried to persuade them, tried to talk rationally, and then you go back and forth, and they're like, nah, fuck it. We want access to affordable healthcare, which should just make your urethra flare up every time you hear it. It's like, yeah, there's access to access. It's a bullshit term. Affordable. It's a bullshit term. Universal healthcare is not a radical leftist idea. It is a normative thing that most countries, most developed countries that are our peers, have had for generations. Sometimes, since post the National Health Service, which is getting undermined by the Tories, the NHS in the UK came about after World War II. We're coming up not that far from 100 years of that. And the US has this fucked up system that costs like twice as much or more per person, and is getting worse, and doesn't cover a lot of shit, has worse outcomes, shorter life expectancies, higher infant and maternal mortality. Thank you, people who claim to be pro-life, and all of this other shit that is fucked up. And it's just, I don't know, it drives me insane to even talk about that. So I'm getting very close to the time. Speaking of meetings, I had to fit this in, do a little window this morning. So I'm gonna have to wrap up pretty soon. But I do want to get into the thing that I wanted to talk about that's a little mathy. I'm gonna, again, try to stay at a relatively high level. But for a project I've been working on for quite some time, I've been working on some radar. And this radar is basically designed to, it's not designed to image stuff, it's just designed to detect presence of people. And to an extent also, activity. So it gets enough information that it can tell if somebody is, for example, standing or sitting or laying down in bed. Gets enough information to tell if somebody is in a room or not, or walking or just sitting. One of the things that it does is recognize like very small movements like breathing or even heartbeat. And the way it does this is something that I'm trying to, it's kind of cool and magical how it works, but also difficult to explain without getting into too much math. But it's a fairly standard, it goes a little bit beyond the standard stuff, but it's pretty standard in terms of radar, like how this works. The standard thing that most radars use, including this one, is something called frequency modulated continuous wave. So instead of sending out, like, you sort of think of the classical thing like a sonar, you send out a pulse, bing, and then you get kind of these pulses back, and those tell you what is reflecting. Rather than doing that, and if you do that, that means you're sending out a really strong pulse. You need very precise timing. I mean, if you look at, this is a cool thing, because if you look at the difference between my hand being here and my hand being, you might not even be able to see that motion in the camera. It's just, like a few millimeters really, maybe even a centimeter. You might not be able to see that. If you look at the light travel time, imagine that the camera is the radar, sends out the pulse, you get the reflection back. The difference in light travel time between those two is measurable. I have time of flight, or I regularly use, they're called time of flight sensors that send out an optical pulse, and then they get pulses back, and they can measure so precisely, like down to sub-nanosecond timing, that they can measure like millimeters, which is just nuts. Now the problem is, of course, this radar, first off, the radar that I'm using isn't the narrowest, or like the wavelength is not the smallest. So you might think you couldn't measure these kinds of small movements, or me just moving around, me breathing, this kind of stuff. But, and this is a very weird thing, if you take it's called a chirp, where you're modulating the frequency, and you start out at a low frequency, and then you speed it up. So it's like, dwing, dwing. I'm sorry if that sounds awful, but it's like a low frequency pitch, or low pitch, and then it goes to high pitch. And it's just, that is the pulse. And it's continuous, so you turn it on at a low frequency, you speed it up, you turn it off, rather than sending out like a ping. Now, once you do this, they do this kind of, this is at very high frequency, so many, many gigahertz. And that means that if you're trying to go through and like look at the signals, this is another thing, you're looking at those signals, you could, in principle, capture those waveforms and then do a lot of processing on the original signal. But if you do that, you need super high performance computers. Like my computer is a few gigahertz, and it's a MacBook Pro, Intel, late 2019, top of the line at the time. And the clock on there is way slower than the radar that I'm using. So in principle, you're like, there's no fucking way that you could make this work. What they do to make this work, and this is again a standard thing, this is not the special stuff that we're adding, but they take that signal that you're sending out, and then they put it in something called a mixer. And they get so you have the signal that goes out, it goes out the antenna, sends it out, and then it comes back. And that response goes into the mixer with the original signal. And the stuff that comes out of that is actually relatively low frequency. And the frequencies, like the stuff that's coming out, look, like audio kinds of frequencies, or maybe at most megahertz. So stuff that's pretty easy for even an embedded microcontroller, not like gigahertz, like really fast stuff. It's getting that stuff out. And the signal that it comes out of that, because of the way it's mixing, is actually going to have this property that's just nuts, that a lot of the frequency domain, so like if you look at those frequencies that come back, if something is at a given distance, then the amount of frequency shift that it gets back is proportional to that distance. So you get like, you can directly transform this from time domain into frequency domain. Sorry, Brian. Hopefully this is not too bad. But you transform it from this times varying signal, like the bing or whatever, to the frequency where you're like, okay, well, at 24 kilohertz, there's this signal. And that is a spike instead of this oscillating thing. And you look at that spike, where that spike is based on the distance. And even there, you don't have a lot of differentiation in the spikes. So if my hand is moving a tiny bit, the spike stays in the same place. So you'd think still, I can't do anything with that. The problem, or not the problem, but the magical thing is, if you look at the phase, so like, does the spike start at a 0 here? I mean, you look at the like when the oscillation starts, it's very sensitive to very small movements. So if you look in the phase part of that, you can actually see stupidly tiny movements based on that phase shift, even though you would think, just doing basic math, that they're like that in order to get this information, you couldn't do it. You look into this more, and it's, I'm trying to race to a conclusion here, sorry. Strictly speaking, I should be done and out the door, but I'm gonna try to wrap up. it's this magical thing, and the thing that amazes me about it is like once you understand it, it's like calculus or algebra or the concept of zero. Once you understand it, and I know people think calculus is hard, but believe me, it's not actually that bad. Once you understand it, linear algebra, it's not that it's I would say it's obvious in retrospect. The person who figured out that you could do this, like mixing these two signals and then looking in the frequency domain and then figuring this stuff out, and then also looking at they're called frames, looking at how they shift over time, lets you do like measure velocities, measure very small movements, measure positions, and then you can do more and measure like angles and all kinds of stuff from what should be like an almost impossible problem. I think that's genius. The person who came up with it, just because I can look up the stuff and see work that other people have done. That's just implementing it and kind of building on it. But whoever came up with that first was just fucking like, it's a glint of brilliance. I love that stuff. So anyway, I am really racing to go. I may talk about that more, but I think that kind of gets the gist of it. Gil, if you want to talk about it, or anyone else listening or watching, you want to talk about it more, I have lots more to say on the technical side, or someone on the non-technical side wants to talk more about it, I'm happy to go in greater depth about that. But it's a very cool thing. You can look up FMCW, and then also there's phase modulated continuous wave, which is a newer sort of thing that's a little bit different, but it ends up being much better for having multiple radars coexisting. The frequency modulated thing, if you have two radars at the same time, then there's crosstalk and it gets painful. Although for my application, we have to work around that. But if you're in a car, it's nice to have radars all around, and you want them to all work at the same time so that you're not like pulse, 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 and then by the time you're pulsing over here, you're missing something happening over here, and then the car hits you. God, I shit tons to say about Tesla, incidentally, negative stuff mostly, but I'll talk about that later. With that, oh shit, I've got to go. Thank you very much. I'm probably going to record another one of these this week, but we'll see. Thanks again, and 再见. Blah, 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 blah.